Hello and welcome back to the Craftsman Online Reading Room. I am your digital Tyler for the evening. Right Worshipful Brother Michael Arcee, and of course, our reading room is presented by Craftsman Online. A reminder that our program this evening is going to be recorded for playback. For those that are not watching us live for the first time ever on YouTube, we are streaming live. This will be a future Craftsman Online podcast episode later this month. Craftsman Online is a New York State initiative founded in 2020 by our Grand Master, Most Worshipful Stephen Adam Rubin, to connect brethren with leadership development, Masonic education, and celebrate the history of New York Freemasonry and the special men who have served and continue to serve our ancient and gentle craft. Before we begin tonight's program, our format has changed a little bit, but the rules are still the same. The experiences, comments, opinions, and views that will be shared during this program are those of individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, or Masonic authority. If you have a question for our guest tonight, feel free to use that comment section in the YouTube live streaming panel. I'll be moderating that, and feel free to ask that question to our guest. With that said, I think the ground rules are set. Please give your attention to Brother Jason Short for this evening's program. Brother Short, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And yeah, welcome again, everyone, to the Craftsman Online Reading Room. On this episode, we'll be discussing a selection on occult masonry of the 18th century from the book, The Path of Freemasonry, The Craft as a Spiritual Practice by Mark Stavish, published in 2021 by Inner Traditions, Bear and Company. I'm your host, Brother Jason Short, along with my co-host and companion for today, Craftsman Online's very own Right Worshipful Brother Michael Arcee, and our special guest, author Brother Mark Stavish, internationally known best-selling author of over 30 books, including The Path of Alchemy, Energetic Healing, and the World of Natural Magic, Kabbalah for Health and Wellness, Between the Gates, Lucid Dreaming, Astral Projection, and the Body of Light, and the Path of Freemasonry, Symbols of Light, and Egregores, among other titles. His work has appeared in French, Spanish, Portuguese, Polish, Estonian, Russian, and Turkish, making him one of the most widely read writers on spirituality and self-help today. For more information on Mark, you can visit www.hermeticinstitute.org. Good evening, brethren. So, Mark,
Good evening.
yeah, I'm very excited to have you on the program to discuss this chapter.
Oh, this is great. I mean, I have to say, this is wonderful that this is an initiative from the Grand Lodge of New York. And this is just one of those reasons that Freemasonry is so dynamic as it is. You know, that people often have questions about Masonry. And I love to say, the lodges are so dynamic. They are what you make of them. And that we have some great educational programs in the Grand Lodges
Mm.
of Pennsylvania, Scottish Rite, Northern Southern Jurisdiction, York Rite, all of these bodies. And it's just great. I just want to, when another Grand Lodge is opening up another educational program, I just want to say it's great. So there's my happy juice for the evening. Yeah.
Well, I hope you're not tapped out. Uh, I'm really pleased that we're able to get you on here and to be able to have a representative from Pennsylvania Freemasonry, which is very different than from New York Freemasonry in a number of reasons. You guys practice York ritual, correct?
hmm
Which
Yeah,
is
the ritual that we do is, I believe, two or three uh, states use it.
mhm,
Okay, or one similar to it, I should say. Um,
right.
yeah,
And that's
it,
based on Amon Rizon, right? The ancients
yeah,
sort of.
it's really when you see it, it's incredibly simple. Uh, I think that that's probably a strength because then you could do it anywhere.
Hmm.
Remember the old idea of the taverns when they would meet above taverns in some of the lodges, or you might have traveling lodges or military lodges. I think probably one of the advantages that, and it's one of the oldest Grand Lodges in the country. So uh, when you look at that, I think that's kind of has a lot to play in with how the ritual was chosen and sustained over the centuries.
Right. Well, I'm really looking forward. We have Unity Day. I believe Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is hosting Unity Day 2025 in January, and Pennsylvania will be doing a degree there. I missed it this last year. I was helping Right Worshipful Stu McLeod coordinate and put everything together in New York, and missed your guys' floor work there. I hear it's mostly the master doing a bunch of the work.
Fundamentally, I mean, it's really stunning. I believe that the middle chamber lecture has 20,000 words in it, something like that. It's just
Mm.
the level of memorization is stunning. It
Oh,
really is.
well, I
Now, what you
found.
guys are famous, what you guys are famous for here is what they do here is they'll even get busloads to come in from Pennsylvania to go into New York City to see Garibaldi Lodge.
Oh yeah. Oh,
That's what you guys are.
Garibaldi will be
That's what you're
making an
famous for.
appearance.
Yeah.
Garibaldi will be making an appearance at Unity Day coming up as well. So, if any of our listeners have not already gotten a ticket and you're looking to participate, reach out to your Grand Lodge representatives, see if you can get out to Philadelphia for Unity Day 2025. That'll be January. Can't remember the exact date. I want to say the 25th, and maybe later in the program, Brother RC, you can clarify that for us. Um,
How did
but
you know I
shoot.
was pulling that up? I know it's the weekend after our first ever New York Masonicon. It'll be held in the Grand Lodge, and that is taking place on Saturday, January 18th. So the Unity Day celebration with the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia is taking place on Saturday, January 25th.
Nice.
I'll tell you, this proliferation of Masonic activities like Masonicon and that kind of thing, something outside the normal range of what we used to see with uh, body activities. You know, each body would have its activities, or the different rites would have their activities. But to see this proliferation like Masonicon and this type of thing is really wonderful because they're so good at bringing together a variety of brethren from really across the regions.
Oh
To
yeah.
come and meet. I mean, it's really great to see.
It's great to see, and I think that that's really going to be the core element in helping to have this sort of Masonic revival move forward, is having more of these unified events and bringing brothers from a bunch of maybe struggling lodges or regions together so that we can celebrate in unity like they were doing back in the early days of the speculative lodges and their feast of St. John's. Like let's celebrate together. Um,
Oh,
well, I mean,
agreed. And just with that, I say to those listeners out here, and I mean, mostly this is a Masonic audience, and Masons love to gripe and complain about their lodges, but I've told young men who want to join, I said, you know what? If you find yourself because of geography or something like that with a lodge that you're not really happy with, a blue lodge, don't worry about it. Between the Masonic Academy in Elizabethtown twice a year and the College of Knowledge was the uh, High Degrees Academy for Northern Jurisdiction, and the what
the
is it?
Hotescrat, yeah.
There's another one, well, College of Rights. There's just so many wonderful groups out there and bodies to join where folks are really involved in understanding Masonry as a philosophy and a way of life that don't let
Well,
your initial experience keep you from pushing further, is what I want to say.
well, and
There's a lot out there.
Mark, I think that's one of the things that I really love about um, your path of Freemasonry. The craft as a spiritual practice is you're really helping, especially maybe brothers who are from these isolated regions or lodges, identify the path that they can take towards the spiritual or philosophical pursuit of the craft, which I do think is a very, very important and for me, profound aspect of the craft. I found the book overall to be wonderful, but chapter 8 in particular provides such a comprehensive overview of the esoteric organizations that developed alongside speculative Freemasonry, in the 1800s and 1700s on up into today. The influence of many of these esoteric traditions really really did have a strong influence on what we have to work with now. Um, and so this chapter, it really for these brethren who are looking for that foundation, you do a wonderful job providing it.
Well, thank you very much. And that was really its purpose. Unfortunately, when that book was first written, that is the revised edition, coming on the earlier Llewellyn edition from maybe 2007, 8, somewhere around there. And my experience with Masonry was very mixed. It simply was very mixed. And again, Masonry is made up of the local people. They will reflect the community for better or worse.
Mhm.
And fortunately, I was able to meet a lot of great folks in the region, but not necessarily people locally, meaning not regionally, but locally, who were really interested in Masonry as a philosophy. It was simply a matter of come to lodge, learn some ritual, have a fish fry, go home. And, that's nice, but as I always say, if it's not for we don't need the ritual in order to be a fraternity. We don't need that. We
Mm.
don't need the ritual in order to be a charity. We don't need that. So if we have the ritual, why do we have it?
Hmm.
What is its purpose? What is the purpose of these other rituals, particularly when we get into Scottish Rite, which, it builds itself as the College of Freemasonry?
Mhm.
And I think that when we saw the early days of the traditional observance movement, where you saw men who were saying, you know what, I want more out of this. I want
Mm.
something that's more traditional, more demanding, is what that means. More demanding, and not just in terms of memorizing ritual. Here's where I'm going to go off soapbox here, or on the soapbox and off tangent. I'm going to say what we all know, okay, and which I've said to many a Grand Master and district deputy. And I'll be polite here. We have to stop the idea that memorizing rituals qualifies you for anything other than reciting a ritual.
Mm.
And we have leadership that is based upon the ability to memorize, not the ability to solve problems, not the ability to have a vision,
Mm.
not the ability to run the organization well.
Mm.
We need to change that so that when we have guys who do ritual really well, maybe let's just keep them around for that. And then when
Mm.
we have guys who can run an organization really well, maybe they should be the master truly in charge for the year. Other
Mm.
organizations run that way, and we need to start thinking about that because one of numbers and also skill set. When people were memorizing these rituals, they memorized a lot. The levels of literacy were much lower. Memorization was the way you did things, even until fairly recently. Technology is counterproductive to what we're asking. We need to really get a handle on this, the psychological and even psychic environment that we're in.
Mhm.
So if we're going to be asking for investing in all this time, we then also have to make the ritual meaningful, and meaningful is in elaboration and explanation. What does
Mm.
this mean? What is the purpose of this?
Well,
How am I to emulate this in my life? Now, of course, we see some of that in the writings of Albert Pike, particularly his commentaries on the Blue Lodge degrees. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. We also see some commentary in some of the things coming out of other authors as well. But I think we need to push that a little more in our lodges because that's That's the point where it matters most for most young men. That's the decision as to whether they're going to stay in masonry or leave it, or which direction they're going to go if they go
So
forward.
you bring up a great point. It makes me wonder too, though, in like every era and every generation with masonry, there always seems to maybe be some sort of external exoteric factor of the craft, as well as the esoteric principles that are trying to maybe push forward. What do you think in the 18th century was really contributing to this sort of rise of mystical secret organization, or the ideology of the Rosicrucians, the Elo Cohen rite, and like Egyptian masonry? What do you think was in the water?
Well, let me just comment. Yeah, it's interesting when you read some of the notes from that period. Even then, they were complaining about the degradation, if you want to call it that, the
Mm.
lowering of standards of regular masonry, because you still had people who would go in. It's still possible to do the degree a month routine, boom, boom, boom. Okay,
Mhm.
um, then you also saw that same statement, of course, in the late or in the early 20th century, that you were referring to guys who were just collecting pins and baubles and keychains and that type of thing. So there's always been that kind of sense of uh, slight criticism of the quality of emphasis on something other than, we'll call it, the philosophical depth. Now, that's not to say it was always that way everywhere. Clearly, it wasn't. But we're looking at people who were more religious in some ways. Now, when
Mm.
I say that, I don't mean they were necessarily more faithful, but they were exposed to religious ideas and on a constant basis. Okay, so this constant exposure had a holdover to a magical worldview. We have to remember that Elias Ashmole, who was also a Freemason and an alchemist, saw the last person executed for witchcraft in England.
Mm.
Okay, we see many of the lodges being places where men of different denominations. Now, in Philadelphia, several of the founding members of the Grand Lodge were Jewish. Okay, we see this in other places as well. And their denominations would have meant primarily different Christian denominations.
Mm.
Okay, so they're coming together, and they're coming together at a time when there was still some, at least early and vague memory, and we'll say, of serious religious conflict. Okay. And
Mhm.
as much as you want to say that Pennsylvania was a Quaker state, the Quakers ran it quite, I'll be polite and say efficiently.
Mhm.
They like their position of authority.
Mhm.
Okay. So we see here this religious notion is constantly somewhere in the common experience. So when they're going into Masonry, and they're hearing these words and hearing these excerpts about, this is something they grew up with. Um, that's not necessarily the case today. And it certainly wasn't the case even 2 generations ago. So I want to put that in mind. There's a different psychological framework.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, the psychological framework of the 18th century would have been that of natural philosophy, which is coming out of the domain of natural magic.
That's right.
So you still
That's
have
like
people.
the Royal Society coming together, and they're trying to draw the line between what's actually physics and science, and what is magic, essentially.
Correct. And the reason they did that was because you had to have repeatability,
Hmm.
and spectral evidence was not allowed. Now, for those who
Right.
don't know what spectral evidence is, that was the principal way you could get someone brought up on charges of witchcraft or malefic magic. I saw a spirit or their cat or their familiar or fill in the blank do blank.
Mhm.
Now, if you look at the actual trials, there's records of them. A lot of these things were dismissed. People, I mean, the judges weren't stupid. A lot of them knew that this was just a way of getting back at your neighbors. But still, it was a mechanism which resulted in the torture and deaths of many, many people. And of
Mhm.
course, the memory of Salem was not that far in the distance. You know, that kind of just hysterical reaction of an isolated people, and they were
Mm.
isolated up there in many ways.
Mhm.
Uh, so this magical world view is looking for a more intelligent understanding. So that would be the way to look at that would be when you see people talking about folklore and folk magic, the new age movement of the day, and then you have the popular quantum physics of the day, if this is making sense to you. So
Mhm.
the mechanisms of the occult movements would be to provide a kind of hidden wisdom that might be the equivalent of the quantum physics view of the day.
Sure, certainly. And
Because
well, I mean, you make a comment about 1614 prior to the Fema Fraternitatis, the universal and general reformation of the whole wide world, which was published, and that was kind of the first reference to there being this idea of a mystical fraternity practicing the arcane arts, and was also then the first published mention of like Rosicrucians. Though you also in your chapter mention that perhaps the Fama and that the Fama may have been circulating as early as 1610 in a manuscript form. So um, this kind of gets me in towards my next question for you in what role myth then plays. You know, in the 18th century, we do see the drawing the line between what's measurable and what is speculative, what's sort of beyond fact and into maybe mystical intention. But when does that line become blurred? Like what is what is the role of myth in creating a foundation for an esoteric organization? And we'll start with that.
well, it's everything. Because most of these organizations are based upon a pious fraud.
Hmm. Yeah,
and
you
and
have.
this is really important because you ask, where does myth and fact, where is that line? And that line is right down the center of something we call initiation.
That's good.
The entire initiatic process is a mythical process. Doesn't mean it's not real. It just means it functions on a level of knowledge that is symbolically related. And again, symbol doesn't mean not real. It means it exists on a level of subtlety that to penetrate its truth requires effort.
Hmm.
And that's
And I
really very
suppose.
important to understand, because we have come to think of symbols as meaning it's not real. We've come to think of myth as not real. Not real. What do you mean by real? What you mean by real is tangible and touchable. That's what we're saying. It's a reductionist materialism is what we mean by real. What it is it's ever closer to the real because the real is very subtle. The real is the divine mind or the monad or whatever you call it from which
Mhm.
everything came. That is the real. Everything else is unreal in relationship to that. That is, it's impermanent and changeable and transient and not self-existing or self-sustaining. That which is permanent and self-sustaining and unchanging is reality itself.
Sure. Well, so then.
Now we use myth to try and manage this. We use myth as a way of trying to engage the imaginative process because the factor or the method of entering into communication with the invisible is through the imagination. And
Mhm.
we do that through symbolic ritual in the physical world in order to stimulate the imaginative process within our mind or our unconscious, which then results in dream phenomena.
Mhm.
And if understood properly, that dream phenomena can then result in various altered states of consciousness.
So, it's interesting too, though. So, like with Johann Valentin Andre claiming to have written both the Fama and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencrantz later on in his life, uh, that this sophomoric joke does end up inspiring, that the myth itself does end up inspiring what's now today a global philosophical and spiritual philosophy movement. Um, and so I wonder too, then, is does that discredit anything that we find in that esoteric tradition, just because the foundation of it may have been essentially a joke? Should Does that discredit any of the spiritual or philosophical growth that has come from it?
My answer to that is yes and no. It discredits it depending on what you're looking for. And if you're looking for a very concrete, provable, factual origin of things,
Hmm.
then it discredits it. But then at that point, you might as well discredit everything. And I mean that in all seriousness.
Right.
I really do.
Totally. Yeah.
Let's start
Absolutely.
scratching the surface of a lot of things.
Yeah.
Well, as you mentioned
And
origins,
let's just stay with that for a second. Let's just scratch that surface on a lot of things, and they are not as they appear, but they
Mhm.
function according to your belief structure. Now, look at what we've seen in the last 40 years, a little longer. We have seen people identify in Australia on a large number, I forget what the number was, but it was shockingly large, as Jedi as their religion.
Mm.
We
Mhm.
see the Harry Potter phenomena going on 20 years now. Really, I mean, come on, still going strong because of its mythic power and content. Because even though it is mythic, in the sense that it didn't really happen, there is no Hogwarts. Okay,
mm,
Mhm. Right. I mean, the
all
chemical wedding is so rich with uh
archetypal symbols.
yeah, that I mean, for especially what's really cool about these books being published in German, as well as I believe it was originally published in 5 languages, but we know that the Latin and the German were still preserved. That was available to the commoner who didn't know Latin, which accounts for a lot. Be it a joke or not, it was certainly entertaining and engaging people's imaginations.
Well, to really understand that, you have to look at the power of the Reformation.
Mm,
And Ioannis Koulianos wrote a book called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, which all of you should read. And then there's another book, I don't see it in front of me at the moment, but it's a commentary on that, in which it looks at Eros and magic in the Renaissance and the ideas of Giordano Bruno as related to mass media and
mm,
idea formation. So if you want to get a handle on kind of what's going on in the world today, uh, other than my book on egregores, which is the short version, if you want
yeah.
to read the college version, read Eros and Magic. Uh, my point there is that the world of the imagination was something which was rich even within Roman Catholic culture.
Mhm,
The Protestant Reformation was basically the destruction of the world of the imagination.
mm,
And that in lies part of the problem when we look at Masonic ritual. Because as the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant influences in the formation of the United States continue to move on, we then see the same thing. This very bare bones, minimalist approach to things that is very concrete oriented.
mm.
mm.
So this has a negative effect. That doesn't mean the imagination doesn't continue to work. Of course it does. You still have one and it can still function, but it functions not to its fullest capacity. And the fullest capacity of the imagination is twofold. It is the imagination is who you are when you're sitting there at the threshold of initiation, literally at the doorway. And one of that directions you can go in is you can just say no, and you can kind of turn around and go back to the physical world because your imagination is constantly directed outward. Your
Mhm.
sensory input is constantly stimulating ideas and appetites and all sorts of wonderful fantasies courtesy of the advertising industry. You sit
Mhm.
there at the intersection on a wonderful day like today when the weather's in the 70s and your window's down and you get that whiff of french fries coming off of Burger King, and next thing you know, you want french fries. That's the power of the imagination. Very physical, very real. The other power of the imagination is, as we see in the uh, teachings of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, in the practice of the Rosary or the Jesus Prayer of the Orthodox or the Vajrayana practices of Buddhism or Tantric practices. The imagination is the gateway to the invisible dimensions, as Bruno spoke of.
Mhm.
So the imagination is not a static thing, it's meant to go in a direction. When the imagination stays stuck in your head only, that's when we have psychosis. That's when you go crazy. So the Protestant Reformation took the imagination and really disconnected it from the invisible.
Mhm.
And that in way that in part is what has happened to masonry in the way we address ritual. We've disconnected it from the invisible. Not completely. We haven't severed the cord. But
Well,
in the 18th century, when you saw this explosion of all these side rites, and some of them were just money making schemes, they were just like, the self improvement course of the day, really, I mean, to what they were. But others were very good alchemical and magical and Kabbalistic systems for their own
mm,
Mm.
period. Those were engaging the imagination so that people could, again, have a connection with the divine in a very direct and
mm.
real manner.
So, Brother Mark, to that, I had a question about this, and to our viewers that are watching the live stream right now, and listeners that will hear this on a podcast after the recording of the live stream, you can still get your copy of the reading room material. He was kind enough to share chapter 8 from his book on occult masonry of the 18th century, and the book, of course, is The Path to Freemasonry. That is available on our website at craftsmanonline.com. Just click on the reading room link. When you talked about this earlier, you had mentioned like a lot of the early 18th century. We saw, of course, the birth of the Grand Lodge of Uggel. Then later on, we started seeing the movement towards independence in America. So this free thinking. But at that time, at least here in North America, you had a lot of men who, as you had mentioned, kind of had a very strong Christian background because that was the predominant religion that would have been practiced in this area. And you had Freemasonry that was still coming over from England, and lodges were kind of being formed here during those colonial times. Do you find, as you were talking about these added bodies, and in the chapter, two of the names that jumped out to me was Rosicrucian, and you also talked about the Rosy Craw. Were these avenues for Freemasons of that time to kind of explore that origin story of Freemasonry, or do you find that it was a way for them to kind of experiment with Freemasonry outside of a more religious church confine?
Well, I have to understand that the 18th century, the colonial period, was again a highly religiously charged environment. It doesn't necessarily mean everybody was going to church. And that's why you would have penalties on people for not attending church. I mean, because these services could be painfully long. You might end up on a Sunday morning in your private box, which you paid for, with lots of blankets on you and your coal or wood stove trying to keep warm, listening to a 2 or 3 hour sermon.
Mm.
I mean, this was painful. So this was, and not uncommon. So attendance records are really something fascinating to read. And also, again, there is a huge variety of denominations. So you might have some places where multiple denominations might even have to share a facility at some point because there wasn't enough for just one.
Hmm.
For each didn't have enough members for their own church or something. Uh, so the religious environment of that period is very complex. You also see in the early 19th century, when we would have thought this was just something not happening, that I remember reading about it was Michael Quinn, who was one of the foremost Mormon historians up until his passing a few years ago. I mean, he wrote a huge book on Mormonism and the magical worldview. And I believe in there he said that, there was a traveling book salesman in the South who sold like $20,000 in books on folk magic and the occult. Now, I want you to think about that. The rural South in like 1800 or 1810, that's a fortune. That's a fortune in books on that topic. So even when we talk about religion, we're still looking at a religion that is deeply involved in, or it has aspects of it that are deeply involved in these magical practices that come from folk magic, because people needed a way of trying to manage their livestock, manage the
Hmm.
world, manage sickness and illness. And that's how a lot of this happened.
Well,
So it's a complex environment is what I'm trying to get through to you. And that, wow, it's really all over the place in terms of what
I,
people believe when and how they practice. So these bodies, these associated bodies that we see coming into masonry, I think Rosicrucianism, uh, it's a later edition, and I think it's an idea to try and hook up with an earlier current. Masonry is trying to look at its myth and trying to connect to something earlier. But there's so many variations of Rosicrucianism that I got to tell you, I mean, I bet if you go to different jurisdictions at different times, you would find different historical reasons for why they're moving into it.
yeah, Israel Regardie has a good book, My Rosicrucian Adventure, and he talks a lot about the kind of diffusion of Rosicrucianism and how it developed into um, a number of different rites and systems, and leading up to today. And I mean,
I think you nailed it though earlier. I think you really hit on it when you said this idea of like a primordial school or tradition.
mhm.
I think that was probably, and this is the best I can tell you. That seems to be my understanding of the big appeal when Rosicrucianism began to take off. That there's this college of adepts,
Mhm.
this college of
Well,
adepts.
and I think that there's for a lot of people, including myself, there's a desire to be reintegrated with that primordial thing, that primordial element, and I think that that's where a lot of like folk magical traditions, spiritual practices, and philosophies are born out of this. There's an innate desire for higher purpose or a universal faculty that we are a part and particle of. I mean, the Order of Night Masons, elect priests of the universe, and Martinez de Pasquale's version of Genesis that he details in the reintegration of beings is super fascinating, and talking about taking not just one religious tradition but multiple mystical and religious foundations that I mean it would be heresy to present this work back then, yet he goes out of his way to pull together an entire system, which he wants to present as part of the Scottish Rite, getting turned down, and then further develops it into its own right. I think that just screams for this desire, and also to your point, Mark, from earlier. It's like the once you scratch the surface of the myth, like everything's very flexible. It all just kind of comes back to that same primordial tradition.
Well, I think when we look at Masonry as a whole, and this is really a critical part, and gives reason for why there's always been this explosion of appendant rites, not quasi-Masonic or non-Masonic, and why these different occult orders have always paralleled Masonry, and why Masons have been interested in them, whether it's the Golden Dawn or Martinism or El Cohen, the different Rosicrucian schools. It's because Masonry has always had the ritual, the symbols, the ideas, but it's never had the practice.
Mm.
So you have the 7 liberal arts and sciences, which, by the way, every brother should spend some time with, because that's more or less our version of mind training, training
Mhm.
the mind so that you can be capable of doing these things.
Well,
But
and also
but just
to
to say, there's no meditative practices, and you see this nonsense across YouTube and other things about secrets of the 33rd and secrets of the high masons. You
Mhm.
don't get taught meditation in Freemasonry. You don't get taught ritual magic.
Well,
You
there's, I think, at least in New York, Mark, there's allusions to in the first degree. There's allusions to meditation. There's allusions to system of Loki, like memorization techniques, and that mastering these things essentially will allow you to progress further. And when we look at the structure of progressing to that of Fallowcraft to the second degree, to where one is presented with the 7 liberal arts and sciences, if you haven't already been directed into meditative practice, if you haven't already been directed into engaging your visual, spatial memory practice, then the 7 liberal arts and sciences are going to go in one ear, go out the other ear. And you're never going to be able to then go from this as a lesser mystery school into a greater mystery school.
Pretty much. I mean, and that's really important. That's pretty much it. So when we hear you have all of these allusions to things, but there's no enforcement of it,
Mm.
because the rush is to get on to memorizing the ritual and getting someone in a chair, rather
Mhm.
than focusing on the individual
Absolutely.
development. And that seems to be something that is 200 years old, that
Mhm.
problem. And so you see these side bodies pop up, and they say, hey, and remember, a lot of these guys at this point, they were at least literate. Most of them by this point, at least in Europe, where you see this real explosion of Scottish, we'll call them Scottish Rite degrees, even if they're not what they
Right.
think they
Yeah.
have Scottish Rite. There's everywhere. Okay. A lot of these guys were wealthy. They were literate. They were educated. They understood the language of alchemy, even if it was just as an abstraction. Alchemy, I think, was taught at Harvard up until 1820s, 30s. So
Mhm.
there's just this notion of it. It's part of the education of the gentleman. So now I want to do something with this. I want to understand these magical practices better. And then you have people like Saint Germain, you have Cagliostro, uh, these folks coming on the scene.
Well, and
And
then
what's
Cagliostro's Egyptian masonry is such an direct dive into the alchemical practice. Even in your chapter, you have a great part where you break down how important 7 was, and that rite tradition, and then anyone versed in alchemy also sees the reasons for 7 there, and that there are a lot of commonalities that are presented in what became modern masonry,
Mhm.
but was presented in what we see today in a lot of jurisdictions, a little different than your jurisdiction, of course. um, but um, but it just kind of barely scratches the surface. And in fact, like in New York, uh, a lot of lodges for their entered apprentices don't do a chamber of reflection. And anybody who's had an opportunity to sit in a chamber of reflection or is familiar with that, really the way to do it involves uh, proper presentation of a certain number of alchemical symbols, and allows the candidate to meditate upon those before entering into the craft. Um, this
I
has
do
been
I do a
sort of.
presentation on the Chamber of Reflection that's really well received.
Mhm.
And I just want to just say that the Chamber of Reflection has a very simple version too. A very, very simple version. And this is something that every Mason needs to understand in the simplified version. It asks you one question, and just one. Why are you here? Now, I want that to be understood because when I give the presentation, I point that out. Why are you here? Why do you want to join this organization that, 200 years ago could get you thrown in the jail? Why do you want to join this organization that was crushed by the National Socialists, by the communists, by the Islamic fundamentalists, by a host of other folks too? Why are you here? And then you ask that question that extends out, why are you in this lodge tonight? Why are you here?
Mm.
And then the question is for right now, why are you here? Why are you on this podcast? Why are you doing this? And then why are you here on this planet? What are you making of your life? So the Chamber of Reflection really simply asks you that question. And
That was
it
very
it
beautifully said, Mark. I do have. We are running short on time. I have one more question, and then I'd like to take at least a couple of questions from the audience. Um, and I'll make it brief, but how central of a role do you believe the Hermetic alchemical tradition is in modern Freemasonry?
well, in modern Freemasonry, none at all. In Freemasonry, I think it's central. And we have good historical documentation for that, particularly when we get into the Scottish Rite.
Mm,
And it's really important that Scottish Rite, particularly those of us in the northern jurisdiction, hold strong to our values. Say, none of this nonsense of changing the name because we want it to be something different. This is the College of Freemasonry.
mm,
Keep it that way. Have demands on your members. It doesn't have to be outrageous, but require some investment, skin in the game to keep people involved and provide something back too. And that providing back is going to be what we see like through the education programs, some great folks in there, great tutoring and mentoring. And then with that, in your own life and in your own lodge, looking at these ideas of these hermetic principles, whatever they may be. There's a variety of places to start. Just
mm.
pick one and start there, and start to apply this philosophy to your life. I think maybe to give you a summary of that is in the Corpus Hermeticum. There's this whole description that is essentially the summation of Hermetic philosophy. It says like can only be known by like. If you don't make yourself like God, how can you know God? If you shut yourself up and say, I'm small and I know nothing and I can do nothing and I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of that, how can you know God?
Mm.
You have to, the initiatic journey is a heroic journey. It should involve a little bit of crisis every now and then, otherwise it's not doing its job. And that's my suggestion because it's there. The hermetic qualities should be there.
That's a great suggestion. Um, well, Brother Arcee, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we have a couple, and you've noticed tonight throughout the program, I've been able to kind of pop up on the screen some of the comments that are coming in as we're streaming live on YouTube. So if you have a question for Brother Mark or Brother Jason, most likely you don't have one for me. Feel free to just type those in the comments, and we'll take them that way. We did also open up a link earlier on our website, craftsmanonline.com. If you clicked on the reading room, you could send in your question to be asked tonight, and we have two from Brother David Carey. The first one for Brother Mark is, why do you think AASR was accepted into the United States as a concordant body? Well, Memphis Mizoram was not. Was it mostly from Pike advocating for the Scottish Rite while talking poorly about Master Masons, or is it something more like missing landmarks and such?
I can't give you a really good answer to that. Will just give you what I understand, and I think that it's up because Pike was a strong advocate for it. That's my understanding, but I can't say any more. my little knowledge of Memphis Mizraim, of course, comes from Italian members. And I think that that makes it very different from what may be going on over here.
All right.
But
And his
I hope.
second
I mean, does that answer the question?
he is listening on the YouTube stream, so I'm sure he'll have a follow up. But he did submit a second question. I'm taking it that he's not in our grand jurisdiction of New York, but I couldn't answer this, so we'll just throw this out to the group. How does New York Masonry feel about Albert Pike? Do they see him as a valid Masonic resource? Brother Carey continued to say that he's read some of Pike's material, but he always felt that there was a cautious mentioning with him being in the southern jurisdiction, and then obviously New York is in the northern jurisdiction, and there might be not a lot of crossover there.
I can't speak for New York. I don't know what goes on there. I can just tell you that my experience in Pennsylvania has been that I think it's just jealousy.
Hmm.
I really do. This guy's been around forever, and you're constantly getting compared to him. I mean, let's face it, until recently, Northern jurisdiction of Scottish Rite, you just didn't want to belong to it.
Mm.
I mean, it was boring.
Mm.
All the smart people went to the Southern jurisdiction. If you compared them, you'd say, what am I in? They're doing all the great stuff down there, and we're just like twiddling our thumbs. Now, that's changed a lot. Some of the grandmasters have really gotten on the ball in the last 5 or 6, 7 years, and they've initiated some really great programs. And you see a lot of change, a lot of good change.
There has been a
But
lot of really good change in the
you
Northern
know,
Masonic
pe-
jurisdiction.
yeah,
There
people
has
don't
also
get it.
been some
It's
very broad strokes that are good in some regards, but I know that some of the more esoteric brothers may be looking at it and see what the Southern jurisdiction is doing, and the Northern Masonic jurisdiction maybe feels a little bit watered down now.
and it should feel that way because it is. I'll just look at. I don't even want to get into details, but look, Southern jurisdiction is light years ahead of us, and there's no reason
Mm.
for that except choices. That can change because all you have to do is change your decisions, change your choices, and they appear to be moving in that direction, which is good. Again, these are decisions that often get made at a level that have to do with membership, who your membership is, trying to maintain that membership and dues. It's not always what is best. It's what's best for the organization at a particular time and place. And those
I
of you
am.
I just want to say, those of you who read, oh, who was that one Masonic? He wrote a Masonic encyclopedia. I want to say Collier, but the name escapes me at the moment. But there was a fellow who wrote a Masonic encyclopedia that was around for quite a few decades. Many people read it, and it just completely dismissed anything that we would consider esoteric or spiritual about Masonry. And it was just one of those bad books that got published, stayed around. So I'm just saying, to answer that question, I think that there's a bit of, being the runt of the litter, jealousy. I really do.
Gotcha. I had one more question before our time expires, and this is just the limited amount that I knew about you before this evening. And again, I was able to read the chapter from your book. I really enjoyed that, and I also enjoyed doing a little studying about you. And as someone who has basically spent over a quarter of your life studying Hermetic studies and really is looked at as kind of an expert on traditional Western esotericism, what moved me is your professional life, how you've done a lot of work for nonprofits and basically for the good of the public. How has that lifelong research kind of influenced how you are outside of the craft?
Well, I think it's um, how has that research influenced how I am outside of the craft? I think it makes it in many ways more difficult because when you're looking at truth, in reality, when there's certain things which are inflexible, and having to stand up for that is very difficult at times, as well as having to present it to people. because they often look at things in very this or that kind of way,
Mm.
when this very inflexible truth can often have several perspectives to it, like a diamond. Diamond's very hard, it's very clear, but there's many facets to it. And trying to get people to understand these many facets is can be very painful and very challenging and detrimental to your well-being if the idea is I want this or I want that. But the notion of masonry is too is that if we're going to be a stone in the Temple of Solomon, we're going to be a pillar in this scheme of the grand architect, that we need to be strong and not crumble under the weight placed upon us or around us. And that's going to mean tremendous sacrifice. And I think that when we look at Freemasonry in the United States, we often look to American Masons normally. Unfortunately, we look to too many of them in a very narrow sense, whether it be the founding fathers or some presidents, some military men. But we have to understand that you're going to be called upon to make sacrifices if you're a real initiate. There's going to be challenges and crises that you're going to have to go through. And that's symbolized in those 3 degrees. But in real life, it's also going to be the same thing.
Mm.
Real death and resurrection aspects to your own life. Real things get put on the line, decisions you have to make for doing what's called your duty. I think Masonry is pretty good at this, this notion of duty. I don't know if it's specifically spelled out, but it seems to be, at least in Pennsylvania, in some of the lectures, it's alluded to. Maybe not with that word specifically, but that is your obligations to your family, your obligations to your profession, your obligations to your community, your obligations to your lodge. And how this works. And we see the same thing in various Vedic philosophies, in which it's you have to, what is your duty, and how do you fulfill that duty? That's the capstone of life, of that pyramid of life. It's where we really, in many ways, get our meaning, our full meaning, rather than avoiding it.
Mm. Well, I think that is all the time we have for tonight. Brother Mark Stavish, I can't thank you enough for spending this time with us. This conversation has been enlightening and very fruitful. I'm going to remember it for a long time, and I'm looking forward to the next time that we can speak a little bit further. Your chapter goes into so much information. We maybe covered about not even half of it. I highly recommend all of our listeners look it up. The Path of Freemasonry, The Craft as a Spiritual Practice is the book. Chapter 8, Occult Masonry of the 18th Century, is what we were talking about tonight. I thank all of our listeners for tuning in. Our digital Tyler, Right Worshipful Michael Arce. My heart always goes out to you. And peace and love prevail.
Thank you very much. It was great being here.
All right, guys.